There are few pieces of media as close to my heart as Calvin and Hobbes. The comic that began in November of 1985 follows the day-to-day adventures of a 6-year-old boy named Calvin and his tiger best friend Hobbes. And no, not his imaginary friend, it is made purposefully ambiguous, I will fight you. Calvin and Hobbes, or more specifically its creator, author, and artist Bill Watterson, raised the bar for newspaper comics, challenging its conventions in new and exciting ways, from experimenting with the strict panel and space standards of the time, to mixing a bold artistic style with witty and charming writing, a feat not seen before or since. In no other comic will you get panels like this. But what really defines the comic is its flexibility. I discovered Calvin and Hobbes as a kid and immediately fell in love with the more fantastical elements, connecting with Calvin's ability to make the most of a mundane situation with his imagination. But even as an adult, I can keep coming back to the same comics and find new things to love. The reason for this being Bill Watterson not limiting his writing in any capacity, but rather writing for himself. It's the reason that Calvin and Hobbes can have deep philosophical musings beyond the scope of a 6-year-old's understanding while riding a red wagon down a hill. This style lends itself to a freedom to explore limitless ideas. Capitalism, environmentalism, misogyny, the list goes on, and part of the fun is discovering something new that you hadn't noticed before. If I'm being honest, this was just an excuse for me to reread all of my Calvin and Hobbes, and let's face it, I didn't need an excuse, only to actually find a theme that I think is worth exploring. As I said, Calvin and Hobbes touches on a lot, masterfully taking ideas so deeply profound that it would take me a lifetime to unpack them, and then compounding those ideas into just a few panels. It's part of what makes the comic so special. You might not always be able to explain the ideas well to others, but they always make sense to you. It's as if Bill Watterson was making the material for each of us individually. Every read-through is like a gift I get to keep opening, and this time was no exception. It was always there, of course, just waiting to be discovered amongst the pages of beautiful artwork and sweet innocence of childhood magic, and I think I finally found it. A theme I think that's pretty obvious. A scathing criticism of consumer identity. Actually, I think that may have been too obvious. I knew I should have done my thesis on how Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2 is just a metaphor for dealing with erectile dysfunction.
Oh no. No!
Ah, well, we're already here and I already made the rest of the video, so what are you gonna do? Now I know what you must be thinking. What? What? So I guess I should first explain how this theme came to me. While reading through some of my earlier issues of Calvin and Hobbes, I stumbled across this strip from April 18th, 1987. The premise is pretty simple and common. Calvin's dad exploiting a gap in Calvin's knowledge by messing with him. In this case, Calvin asks his dad where babies come from, and his dad replies that they are bought at stores, or in Calvin's case, as a discount at Kmart. This upsets Calvin. The last panel being of him crying out in anguish from the new information. The level of distress displayed by Calvin feels like a bit much. Usually when his dad messes with him in this way, it doesn't result in such strong emotions, which got me thinking about what part of this knowledge was so disturbing. And what I came up with was this idea, that who you are, or your identity, is used as a commodity, or something to be consumed, and hence I started thinking about consumer identity. Please stop me if I'm going too fast. Prologue. What? Many of you may be asking yourselves what consumer identity is, and that's okay. I'm fairly new to the idea myself. Consumer identity is the way in which people consume to construct or affirm their own identity. Let's simplify that. Imagine you're a car, like from the movie Cars. Inherently, you're born, or made, the Pixar movie is really unclear on that aspect, with traits that you build your identity around. Maybe you're blue, maybe you're a manual. All of these things are a part of your identity and can be used as a predictor for how you'll consume. But also consider that you're a Led Zeppelin fan. That's also something you can identify as. Well, guess what? They've got a bumper sticker you can buy to outwardly express this piece of your identity, to validate it. In fact, there's a consumable for every aspect of your identity. Maybe you are a lifelong Republican. Maybe you eat vegan because you don't want to eat tractor meat. Maybe you hate the whole capitalist system and you don't adhere to this consumer-based society. One thing that capitalism is very good at is incentivizing finding every possible want and need a person can have and filling that hole beyond capacity. So, inevitably, you end up with an excess of choices. This has been referred to as the paradox of choice. It makes it harder too when the choice you make doesn't even really matter in terms of quality. This was highlighted in a 2005 issue of Consumer Reports where 53 kitchens from different companies were tested and only 2 fell below the line of very good into good. None were considered poor or fair. This presents the consumer with the dilemma of endless choice, and more importantly, leaves companies with the challenge of standing out. Calvin and Hobbes actually touches on this issue in this strip in which Calvin's dad goes on a tirade at the supermarket over the sheer amount of peanut butter varieties. Here's where consumer identity comes in. If the goal is to separate yourselves from other brands in the eyes of a consumer, then the best way to do this is to associate your product, service, or whatever with an identity. You endow it with meaning, a relatability even where there isn't one. More importantly, you give consumers the tools to solidify and signify their identities. How we identify is extremely important. It is our sense of self. But in a capitalist society, it's just another commodity. As Rob Walker summarizes in his novel Buying In, a potent brand becomes a form of identity in shorthand. But let's return to Calvin and Hobbes. Part 1. Text. Just looking at the text itself, it doesn't take a large leap of logic to see the ideas of consumption and identity coming together, especially in later strips. My favorite example is an ongoing in-universe gag where Calvin is subscribed to a magazine designed for gum chewers. The magazine, as Calvin explains, gives you all the inside knowledge, tips, and products necessary to be a world-class gum chewer. As silly as that might sound, being a gum chewer is a way for Calvin to identify. And here you have a magazine that not only validates that part of his identity, but actively encourages a deeper pursuit. The magazine helps to shape the identity itself, giving you the ideal to strive for, and of course selling you all the products you'll need if you want to be a quote-unquote real gum chewer.
I have come here to chew bubblegum and kick ass, and I'm all out of bubblegum.
This idea has been explored by more established YouTubers, specifically Peter Coffin, who calls the way companies cultivate identities, cultivated identity. Again, stop me if I'm going too fast. Also, with apologies to Mr. Coffin, I'll be utilizing a lot of ideas he has presented on the topic. By doing this, the company is trying to nurture a dependence on what they're selling, advocating for consumers to constantly turn to them as a source of validation. Bill Watterson played around with this concept in this early Calvin and Hobbes strip. When Susie questions why anyone would ever buy insurance from Calvin, Calvin responds by firing off his slingshot at her, creating the very circumstances necessary for needing insurance. And yes, I realize that joke isn't as funny explained like that. Now, I'm not saying that this is literal. You know, insurance companies aren't going around attacking people so that their services seem more essential, but by attributing their business to a piece of your identity, they create the same feeling of dependence. In the case of Chewing Magazine, it's not enough to be a gum chewer. You don't get to just claim that identity. It's earned. And when we feel as though we've earned something, we stick strongly by it. And of course, be sure to buy the next issue to find out what 5 things you need for better flavor retention. This isn't on the consumer either. As Peter Coffin explains, it's not a trick. It's a spread out series of small pushes in a direction you already want to go, but doesn't stop when you've gotten as far as you want to go. Marketers and researchers have explored this concept to death. Companies are very in tune with the importance of associating their brand with an identity, and then narrow down the identity to what you can buy from them. How about these various strips that demonstrate what it means for Calvin to be cool as always being tied to a consumable? Or this strip where Calvin purchases a record because it validates his destructive and abrasive personality, declaring in the last panel, "Well, I sure didn't buy it for the music." It's not enough to point this trend out though, but rather I think it's Bill Watterson's intent to criticize it. Any Calvin and Hobbes reader is probably aware of the constant criticism aimed at consumer culture in America present throughout the text. Let's extend this criticism to consumer identity. Going back to Chewing Magazine, we see a subtle but powerful criticism in a strip with the most obvious emphasis on consumer identity. In the strip, Calvin is explaining to Hobbes how such a specifically targeted magazine not only exists, but how there's actually a lot more, catering to even more specific gum subcultures. And then he states, each one encourages you to think you belong to an elite clique, so advertisers can appeal to your ego and get you to cultivate an image that sets you apart from the crowd. It's the divide and conquer trick. Hobbes in the next panel says to this, "I wonder whatever happened to the melting pot," to which Calvin replies, "There's no money in it." The criticism being levied here is by Hobbes, often a voice of reason or perspective throughout the comic. When he cites the melting pot, he's not simply pointing out that developing strongly specific identities has a tendency to divide us, but rather I think he's getting at how pursuing this type of marketing and consumerism is ultimately damaging the pursuit for collective goals. You don't really have to make stuff that's beneficial to everyone if you just narrow your focus down to one specific subculture and sell to them what they already know they want. And on the point of division, there is a seemingly contradictory nature to this in that finding something you identify with can validate your individuality, but also make you feel a part of a community, which is a good thing, and is not where the division occurs. But since it's capitalism's goal to make profit, then it's not enough to simply cultivate this identity and let it be. It needs to maintain it, and so creates an environment where it is constantly threatened. This sounds familiar. Wait, how did Nazis get into this video essay? No, go away! Stop ruining everything! I just want to talk about Calvin. Oh, no! Okay, you know what? It's not kosher to have all this shit on the screen, so if I'm going to talk about this, I may as well take them down a peg.
Springtime for Hitler and Germany.
Ah, there you go. In a lot of ways, Hitler and the Nazi Party's rise to power demonstrates how cultivated identity works. Now, Hitler didn't invent the concept of a German national identity, but he instead co-opted it and pushed it further and further, cultivating it into something that suited his purposes, which gave rise to the Nazis that we know today. You may know this identity as the Aryan race, but in order to solidify that identity, he gave it enemies. Creating an us versus them dynamic is a sure way to validate a group's sense of superiority, and by extension, the individual's own sense of superiority, further solidifying that identity. The only monumental difference between this and consumer identity is that the former was used for political gain, while the latter is used for capital gain. This is not to say that a Star Wars fan is akin to the Nazis or anything like that. The co-opting and construction of identity for a specific purpose is more to the point I'm getting at. That said, the way in which identity is constructed using an us versus them component is what's worth criticizing and is the real threat. Companies aren't going to stop their customers from developing this sort of superiority complex. They're going to incentivize it. So you end up with things like toxic fan communities. It's like they're saying, it's okay, you're better than them, here's a shirt to shove it in their faces that'll be $25. Just look at the way Calvin reacts to Hobbes wearing a sombrero in their attempt to identify as cool. Another criticism to the practice of cultivated identity can be found in a series of panels in which Calvin enters a poster contest. Throughout, he is very sure of himself, never considering failure for even a moment. Until, of course, Susie wins the contest. This enrages Calvin. He describes it as a miscarriage of justice and concludes that the judges were on the take. He goes so far as to demand that his dad call the school board to rip the prize away from Susie, to which his father replies, "Calvin, losing is a part of life. You should learn to be a good sport about it and keep things in perspective. After all, winning isn't everything." And in the last panel of this arc, Calvin shrugs this off as a delusion, to which his dad asks, "You've been watching athletic shoe ads again, haven't you?" That last question completely recontextualizes everything within this arc that preceded it. It proposes that Calvin's attitude, his superiority complex, his complete dismissal at the possibility of losing, stems from the messaging of athletic shoe ads. He's wrapped up his identity in that messaging, that message of being a winner, a champion, superior, and when inevitably he loses, it feels like an attack on his identity, which enrages him. We can only imagine the kind of action Calvin might take had he been older and with more power to exercise than that of a 6-year-old. In fact, we really don't have to imagine it. This shit happens all the time. It is the default for reactionary groups. This begs the audience to question the influence of a consumer-based culture that encourages us to wrap our identities up into products. A few more examples to end this section on. Here's a cool guy saying nobody tells him what to do. He does whatever he wants and he buys this product as a reflection of that independence. You got a You're Not Attractive Enough women's magazine with an article on swimsuits that minimize all your body flaws. The secret to getting donations is to depict everyone who disagrees with you as the enemy. Then you explain how they're systematically working to destroy everything you hold dear. Rock pretends it's still rebellious with its video posturing, but who believes it? The stars are 45-year-old zillionaires or they endorse soft drinks. The revolution is a capitalist industry. If we looked at every comic strip in Calvin and Hobbes that speaks to or openly criticizes consumer identity, then I guarantee we'd be here all day. In fact, don't take my word for it. Please read this incredible comic series and feel free to comment about your own findings. Beyond direct text though, Calvin and Hobbes has something to say about one such identity that has very much been cultivated by capitalism. Part 2. Subtext and Masculinity. Riding off the success of my last video's approach to masculinity, I'm here to once again dig into the strange and complicated nature of mass media and masculine identity. If I were to propose to you the question, what does masculinity mean to you? I'd get 100 different answers from 100 different people, and frankly, that's too much uncertainty for marketers. Masculinity is a somewhat subtextual theme throughout Calvin and Hobbes, and that's not really that surprising. Calvin is a 6-year-old boy whose ideas of what it means to be a man are still being formed, but from the way the comic portrays his current interpretation, we can see a somewhat narrow and familiar version of masculinity. All of the theories explored in the first section apply to how men construct their own idea of masculinity. To Calvin, the idea of a man is not unlike what we see in most popular media, and borrowing from the book titled The 49% Majority, the Male Sex Role, is informed by a narrow set of defining traits. Tough, confident, and assertive, a successful breadwinner, aggressive and daring, and important to note, no sissy stuff. Calvin, at one point or another in the comic's 7-year run, makes reference to his role as a man alongside many of these traits. In fact, he often throws around the word sissy. To call someone a sissy is to directly attack their masculinity. Remember, the point is to foster a sense of superiority, in the case of masculinity, not being a sissy. As has been discussed, Calvin is hyper-aware of advertisement. Here's a silly panel of him stating it's Miller time, which many of us might recognize as the slogan of Miller Lite beer. And if we look to see how Miller Lite advertises, I think you'll quickly see what I'm talking about.
Doesn't matter.
Kind of like how it doesn't matter that you're wearing a women's scarf.
I don't care, I just got one of these.
Well, that's the second unmanly thing you've done today.
What was the first?
I'm on a scooter!
Why don't we just hollow out a coconut, drop in a little umbrella, and call it a beer colada?
Really?
Hey! What are you doing?
Saving you from unmanly behavior.
Well, when you start caring, just take off your skirt and I'll give you a Miller Lite.
In Denise Curvin's essay titled Advertising Masculinity, the Representation of Males in Esquire Advertisements, she concludes by stating, advertising is only one site within society for the reproduction of gender ideology. It is a potent site nevertheless, for it holds out the rewards for continued service within the economic system. In Esquire, and perhaps in most mass market publications, the representation of masculinity is simplified, drawing largely on dominant characteristics traditionally ascribed to males. Many of Calvin's attempts to subscribe to these traits end poorly for him, or just put him at odds with his own self-interest. Don't misunderstand, the traits I ascribe to the push masculine narrative of capitalist America are not inherently bad things for men to have, with the exception of avoiding anything deemed sissy. The real issue, the one I believe Bill Watterson has written between the lines, is the way in which those traits can lead to self-harm when applied through the lens of consumer identity. Again, as Peter Coffin identified, it doesn't stop when you've gotten as far as you want to go. Let's take this arc in which Calvin joins the baseball team. Not because he likes the sport or has any desire to associate with the other children, but because he would be the only boy not playing baseball if he failed to join. It becomes an obligation to do something undesirable for the fear of being labeled a sissy. This translates to our current society just as well as it may have when it was written. In an episode of Hidden Brain entitled Man Up, the podcast explores the phenomenon of an increase in unemployed men, despite increases in job openings. The guest of the show, psychologist Jennifer Bosson, proposes that the limitations of how men construct their masculine identity has a large part to play with that. To illustrate that, the podcast sits down with a man who, after leaving the military, almost didn't take a nursing job because of its conceived femininity.
The first thing that went through my head was, well, that's a woman's job. That's a female job. That's not something that really men go into.
As Miss Boston describes,
my collaborators and I argue that the male gender role itself is kind of conceptualized as a more precarious status. So manhood is something that's hard to earn and easy to lose relative to womanhood.
Masculinity is hard to earn and easy to lose. We see how Calvin responds to these threats in his interactions with Susie Durkins. Though it is implied that Calvin and Susie can be fond of each other, Calvin always identifies a threat to his masculinity in any expression of that fact, and actively pushes Susie away. Women fulfill both the role of enemy and object of desire within the context of masculine consumer identity, and when I say enemy, I mean to say that they are the opposite of everything the consumer needs to be masculine. But extending this practice will push everyone away. Have you ever met a Star Wars fan whose need to validate their identity and their perceived superiority was completely off-putting? Just replace Star Wars fan with manhood, and that's all I'm getting at. Putting the consumer's identity in such a fragile state makes them more susceptible to a product that promises to strengthen it. The hierarchical nature of capitalist society only furthers a feeling of emasculation amongst men by constantly showing a version of masculinity that holds power they don't. Quoting from Miss Curvin's essay once more, Broad's discussion of capitalism and masculinity in the making of masculinities suggests that social attitudes towards men must be seen in terms of the economic system. The shift in capitalism from power resting in the individual's hands to institutions controlling power had great implications for the male role, resulting in a contradiction between public male power and the feeling of men's private powerlessness. While power is still a masculine prerogative, it rests within the institution, not within the man. Broad claims this situation makes men cling all the more tightly to sources of masculine identity validation offered by the system. Compared to the self-made man of commercial advertisement, the real world of monotonous and meaningless work can feel incredibly emasculating. Often, we see how the system leaves Calvin creating a world of escapism. If Calvin and Hobbes was darker and grittier, the setup might sound a lot like Fight Club. Guys, please email me your fanfics. It's no coincidence that Calvin's three most imagined personas are based on the masculine icons of different eras. So it's easy to see why anyone would be critical of the practice of consumer identity, but let's talk about the man that really matters here. Part 3. Context. We often view works of art in a bubble, forgetting that outside of them is a whole world of gravitational forces pulling them in different directions. To get a sense of a work and look at it critically means stepping outside of it for a moment. We have to step back and see it against the backdrop of the times it was created. For Calvin and Hobbes, this means looking at the life and philosophy of Bill Watterson. Bill Watterson is the sole creative force behind Calvin and Hobbes. This allowed him the freedom to talk about the things he wanted to talk about, and never have his message muddied by conflicting inputs. He had a degree of artistic integrity that set him apart from other creators, and it led him to do something that many might consider radical. He never licensed his characters. You may notice that Calvin and Hobbes are not available in any form outside of the books. You won't find a Calvin and Hobbes t-shirt at Hot Topic, there are no trailers for a Calvin and Hobbes movie, and it's all due to that one decision. In the few interviews that he has given, he answers to why he chose to do this. This quote from Mr. Watterson sums it up well. "I'm not interested in removing all the subtlety from my work to condense it for a product. The strip is about more than jokes. I think the syndicate would admit this if they would start looking at my strip instead of just the royalty checks. Unfortunately, they are in the cartoon business only because it makes money. So arguments about artistic intentions are never very persuasive to them. I have no aversion to obscene wealth, but that's not my motivation either. I think to license Calvin and Hobbes would ruin the most precious qualities of my strip, and once that happens, you can't buy those qualities back." In a way, I feel as though Mr. Watterson was saving us from this cycle. He's allowed us to make what we will of Calvin and Hobbes without companies attempting to define it for us, only to sell a more hollow version back. You may ask yourself why he is the man to tell us this, what makes him so understanding of these concepts. Well, it helps that for almost 4 years he worked on car and grocery ad layouts for minimum wage. This is just speculation, but being in any environment for 4 years is enough to start understanding how that environment works. And I imagine that the whole experience left him with a sour taste in his mouth when his takeaway from the job was, one might charitably say that the boss had rage issues, so the office environment was dreary and oppressive, except when enlivened with episodes of fire-breathing insanity. At another point in time, a syndicate expressed interest in Watterson's work but failed to see the potential in his original idea, instead asking if he would like to create comics for a robot character they had obtained the rights to. The plan was to use the comics to sell a line of toys. In a way, they were asking Mr. Watterson to help define the identity they would be slapping onto a toy. When talking about this, he calls the very question offensive. He was pushed hard on the issue of licensing. Reflecting on it, he called the ordeal personally traumatic, and poisoned the idea he had to spend his life cartooning. This is a man who has strong convictions, and they've only seemed to grow stronger in the years since. I think it's also worth noting the period of time in which the comics came to be, the 80s. America during this time was experiencing a major shift in consumer culture. While the 70s saw Americans attempting to connect and understand themselves, the 80s saw a rise in materialist culture. Who you were became about what you owned. Reagan's presidency helped foster in a new era of nationalist consumerism too. You can say that consumption must have felt like a form of patriotism in a time when the Cold War was in full swing. Watterson, while isolating himself during the majority of his writing, wasn't immune to the political landscape. Long before Calvin and Hobbes, he had attempted to become a political cartoonist, and had studied many political theorists and philosophers including Thomas Hobbes, where he got the name for Hobbes, and... wait, Karl Marx? Oh my god, it all makes sense now. Calvin was a funnel for communist critique. How did I not see this? Even his color scheme makes sense. Oh, I had heard about children being indoctrinated by social justice, but I never knew I was already a victim. Oh god, what's happening? I'm changed. God, what is my revolution? So, what are we to make of this criticism? How do we take it and apply it? Well, I can't really tell you that, but we can look to Calvin and Hobbes for inspiration. There's an arc of the comics where Calvin wins a propeller top beanie from his favorite cereal. The majority of the comic takes place while he waits for his hat to arrive in the mail. This was before Amazon invented instant gratification on every conceivable thing. Throughout, the detailed backgrounds turn to absent ones, the world essentially falling away from Calvin's mind, focusing on the one thing that will make him complete, who he was meant to be. The detail comes back in 3 panels where he imagines himself soaring through the skies with his beanie before the illusion shatters. Another 3 panels has only a thought bubble imagining just his head with the beanie atop. When it finally arrives, it's in pieces needing to be assembled, and in the midst of hastily assembling it whilst keeping it from Hobbes, he snaps a piece, sending him into an emotional spiral. After he calms down, his dad helps him fix it, and soon it is complete. But it turns out to be a disappointment. I love this arc. Not only is it funny, but it neatly ties up the problems inherent to selling someone a piece of themselves. It's always inevitably hollow, but at the end of the comic, Calvin realizes he can do a lot more with the box the beanie came in. It seems that our identities don't always have to be validated by such narrow margins. We get to choose what fits us best. Companies are so busy trying to sort us into an easily manageable box, while Calvin is constantly redefining that box. On a final note, there is an arc of Calvin and Hobbes where Calvin's home has been burgled. Without hesitation, Calvin rushes to find Hobbes. In that moment, he has forgone any of the material objects that once validated his existence, for the only one that really matters, his friend, his best friend. The comic's last few strips has the members of the family coping with the loss of their possessions and sense of security, before coming to the conclusion that it doesn't really matter when they still have each other. It's a heartwarming message, and I think it demonstrates what's really at stake when we wrap who we are into consumption. We risk forgetting what really validates us: each other. The connections we create by exploring and creating our own identities organically. And those connections then form the basis of our own identities, resulting in something stronger. It's Calvin and Hobbes, not Calvin with Hobbes. If we spent more time recognizing the connection between our identities, then maybe we'd be better off. So, go exploring for who you are, and be sure to hug those that connect with you along the way.